The murder of 22-year-old Karabo Mokoena by her ex-boyfriend Sandile Mantsoe sparked outrage in South Africa, the country in which the crime occurred. In a country ravaged by high rates of gender-based violence, Karabo's story was the trigger for the hashtag Mineri Trash movement that saw this epidemic be forced into the faces of those who ignore it. Sadly, despite the rally for change and promises by political leaders, South African women still are not safe in their country, with few changes being implemented to help the country's most vulnerable. Karabo's case may be horrific, but she is sadly one of many. This is her story. Karabo Mokoena turned 22 on March 27, 2017. Karabo's family called her, eager to wish her a happy birthday, but they received no response. The following day, Bontle, Karabo's sister, got a call from Karabo. She was in the hospital. Bontle was shocked to hear this and even more shocked to hear the reason why Karabo was there. She told me that Sandile had assaulted her. She was all bruised. Her eyes were bruised. Her leg was bruised. Bontle later testified. She also said that the reason why the family couldn't reach Karabo's phone was that Sandile had smashed it. As is so common in domestic violence cases, Sandile manipulated Karabo, and despite her family pleading that she leaves him, she said she loved him. Sandile was married at the time and the father of 3 children. He and Karabo had been dating from around October 2016. It is believed that Sandile and his wife were estranged. Karabo staying with Sandile baffled her friends and family. She was a strong, independent woman who didn't seem like the type to allow that sort of treatment, though no woman ever really does. This hadn't been the first time he had been physical with her. Karabo's family implored her to go to the police station and report the assault. Shockingly, Sandile was the one who got there first, and he claimed that it was Karabo who assaulted him. Karabo was the one with bruises all over her body and the one who was in the hospital, but it was Sandile who had been allegedly assaulted. Karabo did go into the police station to report the incident, but her family later said that the officer she spoke to seemed disinterested. She was told that the police didn't have time to investigate he said, she said claims. After her hospital visit, Karabo decided she needed time to think and stayed with friends for a week. Around the middle of April, Karabo was out at a club when she encountered Sandile. Karabo called her mother, who told her to leave and get out of there. Karabo didn't leave though, and the night ended with her and Sandile talking again. They then started their relationship again, which greatly concerned those close to Karabo. Karabo didn't jump straight back to how things had been before. Instead of moving back in with Sandile, she remained living with her friends or with family and went out with Sandile on various occasions. A month would go by after the March incident, and again, Karabo was not reachable. Karabo had gone out to a nightclub with Sandile and told her mother this. She said to not expect her home, as she would be spending the night at Sandile's apartment. Witnesses claim that the couple had gotten into a heated argument that night before leaving together. Lolo called Karabo at one stage during this night, but Karabo said she couldn't talk. The following day, Karabo was nowhere to be seen. Her family and friends were unable to get a hold of her, and she hadn't returned home. Her family immediately contacted Sandile, but he told them that he hadn't a clue where she was. Well, his exact words to Karabo's mother, Lolo, were, "Momzo, I don't know where she is, but I didn't kill her." Her family then reported her missing. On April 28, 2017, the body of Karabo Mokoena was found in a shallow grave on a piece of veld, or grassland, near Corlett Drive in Lyndhurst, close to the city of Sandton. Police had just one suspect from the start, Sandile Mantsoe. Sandile would eventually claim that he had returned to his Sandton apartment and discovered that Karabo had taken her own life. This was at around 1700 to 1800. He said he panicked and knew that her family would place the blame on him, so he decided to get rid of her body. The callousness that he showed is absolutely disgusting. Sandile stuffed Karabo's lifeless body into a wheelie bin and began to clean up his apartment to remove all evidence of Karabo having been in the flat. He then drove to get some petrol at a garage, which is a gas station for non-South Africans, and drove to his mother's house in Bramley to pick up pool acid and a tire. Sandile then took Karabo's body to this deserted area and burnt her remains. "I was there. I removed the body from my apartment. I put a tire around her and burnt her. I put petrol on her and walked away," he later said. That is the same story that Sandile told at his bail hearing after he had been arrested for Karabo's murder and was awaiting trial. He was denied bail. Pathologist Malarato Ramela conducted Karabo's post-mortem examination. She was later called as a witness by the state prosecution in the trial. Malarato found that a large portion of Karabo's body was absent and that she wasn't able to determine whether she had been dead or alive at the time that she was torched. Karabo's remains had burnt severely, so much so that she was unrecognizable. During the investigation, officers found very suspicious things in his apartment and apartment complex. A housekeeper for the building had found personal effects belonging to Karabo, such as her ID card and passport, in the 4th floor dustbin, which happened to be the same floor that Sandile lived on. Before he was arrested, officers had asked Sandile whether they could search his apartment. He agreed and led them up to the 4th floor. The first obvious thing that these officers noticed was that the carpet on his floor was damp. Sandile explained this by saying he had it cleaned since he was thinking about selling the apartment and wanted it to look its best. An officer then spotted a small rug next to one of the windows. Upon moving this rug, visible blood was found. It was after this discovery that Sandile was taken into the station for questioning. Sandile's trial ran for approximately 15 days. On the final day of Sandile's trial, both the state and defense gave their closing arguments. For those who aren't familiar with the South African court system, a judge decides these cases. They do not have jurors. Acting Judge Pete Johnson was presiding. The judge had questions for both sides. The state was represented by advocate Bakanyuswa Marcella, who summarized all the evidence in the case before concluding. The state believes that it has proved its case beyond a reasonable doubt. This evidence included the dumping and burning of Karabo's body on Corlett Drive, to point at the fact that Sandile was responsible for her death. Other evidence was the CCTV footage from the night of Karabo's death at Sandile's apartment. Judge Johnson did interpret Bakanyuswa's closing statement there and said that he found it difficult to accept the state's findings from the CCTV footage, in terms of Sandile leaving a knife in his pocket in the footage. This was something that the state had argued. Judge Johnson said he needed more than photographs to prove that. Bakanyuswa then moved on to the previous assault that happened on 27th of March 2017. The state argued that these injuries were inflicted by Sandile, a claim that Karabo's best friend Stephanie Leong and her sister Bontle supported. After speaking about the video footage, Marcella turned to the assault charges, saying the injuries the deceased sustained on March 27, 2017 were indeed inflicted by Mantsoe, as supported by Mokoena's best friend Stephanie Leong and sister Bontle Mokoena's testimony. Bakanyuswa went on to say that Sandile did not bother to take the deceased to the hospital himself. He was afraid he would be arrested. She then said that Sandile should have testified himself as to how Karabo received those injuries. Here, Judge Johnson interrupted the advocate and reminded her of Sandile's right to remain silent. He also said that there was no witness to prove that it was Sandile who inflicted those injuries. Bakanyuswa said that the defense's claim that Karabo was suicidal held no weight, and that Sandile was the last person she was seen with. Sandile maintained that Karabo had stabbed herself, and addressing that, the prosecution said, "Is it a coincidence that Karabo stabbed herself while the accused had dumped her body?" The state again brought up the CCTV footage, but this time a different aspect of it. Sandile left his apartment at 6:22 p.m. He came back at 6:26 p.m. That gave Karabo 4 minutes to supposedly kill herself. The prosecution said that this wasn't enough time for Karabo to take her own life. And Bakanyuswa also questioned why Sandile hadn't asked the apartment security guards for help upon finding Karabo's body. Bakanyuswa's closing statement was that how Sandile dumped and burned Karabo's remains was well orchestrated. She argued that this assault showed premeditation. Judge Johnson interjected again here and questioned whether there was concrete evidence that the accused premeditated the murder. Bakanyuswa said that the fact that Sandile had admitted to Constable Helen Maweti that the murder was a ritual sacrifice showed premeditation. Judge Johnson said that the evidence concerned him, saying he was concerned about the reliability of evidence. This was because the testimony had been disputed and only one witness had made the claim. After Marcella had finished, defense advocate Victor Similane presented his closing argument. Victor started by discussing the constable's testimony. He said that the story about the ritual was circulated by the media, which influenced the constable. Judge Johnson interjected and said that the argument cannot be proven. Victor carried on to say that the testimony given by Constable Helen Maweti wasn't accurate, saying that she would have collected blood evidence from the crime scene if she was an honest officer. He then said that the constable must have been watching too many Nigerian movies, saying that her testimony was fabricated. The defense then argued that Karabo's injuries from March 27th were not inflicted by Sandile, as there was no evidence to suggest so. He said that meant that Bontle and Stephanie's testimonies were therefore hearsay. There is no verification or corroboration from any other witness that Karabo was assaulted by the accused, Victor said. To finish off, the defense addressed Karabo's supposed suicide. Victor argued that the state's claim of Karabo being killed earlier in the day wasn't possible, as for Sandile to be able to move her body. Rigor mortis could not have set in which would have been the case had she been killed earlier. Judge Johnson then brought up the fact that Karabo was killed with a knife, asking, if the court rejects that she committed suicide, what would remain? There is no allegation that she was killed by anyone else. The only conclusion that the court can come to is that he stabbed her if they figure she didn't commit suicide. Sandile had pleaded not guilty to the charges of defeating the ends of justice, but the defense admitted that he was guilty of the moving, dumping, and burning of Karabo's remains. Sandile had previously tried to make Karabo out to be a violent-natured person. There was a statement read out in court in which Sandile had claimed that Karabo used to beat him up, saying that she became depressed and angry after she was sexually assaulted by a friend of one of her ex-boyfriends. Sandile also tried to say that Karabo used to self-harm, saying that her sister had even seen her do it. He also claimed that he had once found Karabo on the floor next to a box of sleeping pills, and that a security guard at the apartment was witness to the incident. That security denied the claim. Back to the court hearing. Victor Similane was finished with his closing statement and the court was adjourned for tea. Judge Johnson returned and announced his verdict. He started off by covering what the allegations were saying. The state alleges that the accused and deceased had a relationship and the accused assaulted her, killed her, and disposed of her body by burning it. The judge then went through each of the witnesses' accounts. He did find that the accused and deceased had an altercation on March 27, but the deceased sustained no injuries, but subsequently she ultimately ended up in the hospital. Judge Johnson also found that Sandile did place Karabo's body in a dustbin or rubbish bin and move her body to his car at 2:48 a.m. on April 28, before driving to Lyndhurst and disposing of her remains and setting her alight. This evidence was undisputed. Counts 1 and 2 were in dispute though, said Judge Johnson. Count 1 was assault with the intent to cause grievous bodily harm, and Count 2 was murder. Judge Johnson had to decide whether the evidence pertaining to the assault was admissible, since no witnesses were there to confirm whether Karabo and Sandile had been in a physical altercation. The only available evidence was Stephanie Leong's testimony. Stephanie said she had received photos from Karabo that showed her injuries on March 30th, 2017. I don't believe that Karabo explicitly said Sandile beat her, but it was implied, and while the statement was declared hearsay, Judge Johnson decided to allow it in the interest of justice. The judge then went over Captain Malongo's testimony. Captain Malongo had said that Sandile had admitted to him that he murdered Karabo, but refused to have what he said written down. It was this fact that led to the testimony being disputed. Judge Johnson deemed the testimony admissible, saying that the captain had no motive at all for falsely implicating the accused. Judge Johnson then said that Sandile was dishonest. The accused was not an honest witness, since he had given conflicting instructions to his advocate, the judge said. He then questioned Sandile's claim about Karabo taking her life, saying that if that had been the case, he would have called security and gotten help instead of covering it up. The last thing someone would try to do in the suicide of a loved one is trying to exonerate himself, said Judge Johnson. There was nothing for him to be afraid of because everyone would see what he saw. He went on to say that Sandile had meticulously covered up the evidence, but he found himself caught in a web of lies. Then came the verdict. Judge Johnson admitted that the court could not determine whether Karabo's murder was premeditated, but Sandile Mantsoe was found guilty regardless. Karabo's family was relieved to hear the news. As her name states, Karabo is an answer to what happened. I've been having mixed emotions about everything because of the evidence, but today is when I saw that there is justice, said Lolo Mokoena. On May 3, 2018, Sandile Mantsoe received his sentencing and Judge Johnson wasn't shy in his description of the killer. The court cannot describe you in any other way but as a devil in disguise. I am guessing you thought that your riches would get you anywhere, but they got you nowhere, he added. Sandile's lawyer rallied for his client to receive a minimum sentence, but the judge said Sandile deserved nothing less than a harsh punishment. Sandile was described as a danger to society and sentenced to 30 years for murder, 5 years for assault, and 4 years for defeating the ends of justice. 2 of the 5 years for assault would run concurrently with 3 of the 4 years for obstruction of justice, effectively making Sandile's sentence 32 years. The hashtag Maneri Trash movement started in 2016 when various South African women began calling out the problematic behavior and violence towards women that is so prevalent in South African society. But it was Karabo's death and murder, along with the sexual assault and murder of 3-year-old Courtney Pierres, that were the catalyst for the movement. Women began sharing their stories across various social media platforms of the ways they had suffered at the hands of men. However, the hashtag received pushback with the hashtag Not All Men being used as a response for people who felt uncomfortable about the questions being raised about South Africa's serious gender-based violence issues. But those who understand what the movement is truly about, or those who have been at the receiving end of such violence, see it in a completely different view. The movement raises questions about masculinity and what it encompasses, and the fact that whether they like it or not, men are the reason that South African women feel unsafe. If you want to learn more about the movement, we will include a link to a well-explained write-up by former Rhodes University student Sandile Mantsoe. As I mentioned at the beginning, Karabo's case is far from an isolated incident. This is probably what makes her death even more tragic. The fact that murders like hers happen far too often. Karabo Mokoena was a beautiful young woman who had her whole life ahead of her. Thankfully, justice was served and Sandile Mantsoe won't see beyond prison bars for many years to come.